Hey, I'm Ray, and before getting in this video, I'd like to let you all know that this is a new type of content for me. Please give me any tips that you have in the comments, and I'll try to read them all. Just try to be kind, because I'm a little sensitive. And if you have any questions about the speed paint that's going to be played in the background, feel free to leave a comment if your questions aren't already answered in the description. So we're all used to hearing about, the bad art teachers, right? Like, the ones that seemingly hate you for no reason, or just give you a bad grade because you draw anime. I have my own thoughts on the whole anime situation, but that could be a video on its own, and I just don't have the time to get into it right now. I personally have never had a huge issue with the art style thing, because I have more of a Western style, or even sometimes surrealism or semi-realism, if I'm working on traditional art. But I'll get more into this later. I'm gonna be talking about the art teacher in my middle school that everyone just kinda seemed to hate for no reason, but I loved her with all of my heart. In fact, I benefited from her because I had her at such a young age. See, when I was going into middle school, we're all given this class selection sheet, and it's a huge deal to me as a little kid because I can't stand most Common Core classes like history or math. It's just boring to me, and it's a lot more effort than it feels worth. And at the time, I was beginning to semi-consistently post my art online to hopefully eventually make a career out of it. And I was really looking forward to getting to an art class to improve my skills, but there was one problem with this, and it was that everyone hated the teacher. And I mean everyone. Even my friend's mom that worked as a photography teacher at my high school right now didn't like this woman. So initially, I didn't even want to sign up for the class, but due to overcrowding, when I was handed my schedule, I got art for the last semester. To put it simply, I was terrified. I wasn't willing to let my grade tank just because some old woman didn't like my anime or was too harsh on grading. Because these are the kinds of things I always heard. I always heard that you'd basically fail her class for no reason or get a C or below. But as middle school went on, being the nuisance that it is, I became less worried about the class and more concerned about just getting the year over with. So, as the year progressed, the fateful first day of art class drew near, and it became more and more appealing. I would finally get out of my dreaded creative writing class that turned out to be more of a journalism class, and I could finally blow through a class that I was already very experienced in. On the first day, I finally met her. Let's call her Mrs. Tripp. She was an older woman, her hair was visibly graying, but regardless, she seemed content with her job, maybe more or less a little stressed out. She always wore tie-dyed clothes with blue jeans and an apron. Maybe not the first thing that comes to your mind when you think an art teacher, but upon seeing her, it wouldn't be completely unexpected. In fact, that might even be the first job that you assumed she'd have. So, right off the bat, she seemed extremely strict. She often threatened to mark kids down for talking, or really emphasized the importance of copying notes word for word, which was something I personally struggled with. One of my biggest learning techniques is to rephrase notes, because that's just what helps me memorize things. It's just what gets things in my head, to put it simply. So, for the majority of the semester, I dreaded Mrs. Tripp's class. Even being seated next to my best friend wasn't gonna help. Her desk basically had a full view of the entire classroom, and that made it really difficult when you're in a class that's so silent out of fear that you can hear a pen drop across the room. Keep in mind, this class was about twice the size of any normal classroom because she was in a jointed science class. Because initially, the school wasn't planning to have an art class, or at least not on the first floor. But just in general, I did pretty well in the class. I aced every test. I generally only got marked down for not copying definitions word for word, as I'd already studied most of the content in my free time a few years prior. But the thing I enjoyed most about the class was the projects. In fear of getting marked down and having to deal with my mom's strict expectations on my own grades, I found myself leaning more towards a Western style inspired by Ed's World rather than my previous more anime-esque style. As I pushed myself further and further from my comfort zone, I realized I enjoyed this quite a bit more than my previous style, and it gave me more freedom with my lines, my shading, and my proportions, something I really enjoyed. Along with my art style being pushed, I was also pushed to reference still life and work with different mediums. Before this class, I hated still life with every fiber of my being, to the point where if somebody requested me to draw something from real life, even if they were a close friend or even a family member for a gift, I'd flat out tell him no. I'd beg him to tell me to draw something different, draw them fan art, if anything. I also basically only worked with oil pastels, colored pencils, and graphite. Occasionally alcohol markers, if I had some. But in this class, that wasn't gonna slide. Nearly everything in the class was abstract in some way, shape, or form, and almost always was mixed media. Surprisingly, as we worked on all the projects I would have previously dreaded, I found myself improving, rapidly at that, even in digital art. I found these new limits being pushed further and further, and they only grew stronger with the strain. I liked the challenge of my art, as it was previously at a halt for my anime style that I just couldn't see myself going anywhere with. I think this is a good time to mention, I have nothing against anime art styles. In fact, I still watch anime to this day. Albeit not as frequently as I did during my weed phase at the time, but I still do. I just couldn't see myself using the style to take me anywhere in the art world. If anything, it began to feel too repetitive. It lacked the more excessive expression that I crave so dearly when transferring to my more cartoony and exaggerated style. So, as time passed, my class with Miss Tripp began to come to a close. I found myself becoming sad over the lack of time I had left with her, but as I found myself being rather upset, I heard nothing but the opposite from others, hearing them constantly complain about how strict she was, how she cared too much about anime, how she was too particular about the details in our art projects. The more and more I heard this, the more I got upset, and eventually I found myself standing up for her. No, I didn't like how strict she was on talking, but I understood where she was coming from. Art is supposed to be a solitary activity, especially when you don't want everyone to copy each other or have heavy influence from each other. You want everyone to have a unique project, and she generally gave us a good prompt and really generalized instructions. No specific guidelines on the projects, just what she expected the project to look like. The more I heard these people complain, the more I noticed that they were the same people speaking to her with little to no respect, ignoring her pleas for silence in the class, even if it was just for a few minutes. The same people that were sleeping through tests, and the kids weren't hated for no reason. She just didn't like them because they were hopping on the bandwagon of disrespecting her, because that's what was expected from everyone else. No one liked her, so they thought that they shouldn't either. I genuinely believe that they expected the class to be pass or fail, a class that they could do the bare minimum in and still ace. But that's just not what art is. It's a commitment that takes time and a lot of years to develop and practice. Eventually, my 7th grade year came to an end and I thanked her. I still have all my art from that class to this day, and that wouldn't be my last year with Mrs. Tripp. My 8th grade year, I didn't even bother choosing classes. I knew I wasn't going to get the ones I wanted. I just selected art and PE. And I was right. That year, I got PE and creative writing, as my school had very little options for electives. God knows I wasn't going to do creative writing again, and basically every student had PE unless they had a medical reason, because that was the largest class for them to cram kids into. So, the first week of school, I waddled my little butt down to the counselor's office and requested the change, as I knew this was the only way I was going to get any of the classes that I chose. I would never have been able to pull together the mental capacity to tolerate that creative writing class for another year, and I just couldn't handle it on top of my mental state and my emotional issues at the time. Middle school was a rough year. So, as I looked over the other possible options with my counselor, I began to realize that there really was no way out of it for that period. So we swapped around my hours a bit, and even then the only possible options was a second period of PE, which God knows I wasn't willing to put the energy into, and art. And despite initially being opposed to the idea, I agreed under the circumstance that the teacher was changing projects from last year, and thankfully this is what she was planning on doing anyway. So I scooted right along to that class for the rest of the period and the rest of the year. When I entered the class, Miss Tripp was ecstatic to have me back and welcomed me with open arms, as we had developed a pretty decent teacher-student relationship from last year, and it was past the point of work and more to general conversation and small talk. Whilst everyone set up their bins for the semester to keep their art supplies in and other projects, Mrs. Tripp and I discussed how the semester would go, considering I had already done all the tests and passed little to no mistakes at all, and I generally had a well above standard understanding of what she was expected to teach the kids. She offered to give me free rein of the class's supplies, and pass any tests with an A other than the final, of course. And as long as I did any project that she assigned to me personally, or gave the class if I had finished mine a bit early, I was fine. I was basically one of her student aides, with permission to use any of her art supplies. That year was heaven. I tried every art supply I could possibly get my hands on, and I found many of my future favorite mediums and art styles. At the end of the year, I thanked her for everything. I took a photo with her and said my farewells, and I still occasionally see her to this day, whenever I'm helping out at the middle school for completely unrelated reasons, and I continue to miss her class. Despite not necessarily agreeing with her strictness, I can't ignore the amount of growth that I made from her class and all the positive experiences I had, be it or not that I agreed with the teacher as a whole. So I guess the moral of the story is, don't believe everything you hear. Experience things for yourself, and don't be afraid to challenge and push yourself. It may benefit you greatly, or maybe introduce you to something that you would have never experienced previously. Hopping on the hate bandwagon is a very toxic experience for everyone involved, and it's very important that you combat this as well. Please try to do your own research and experience things for yourself, as long as it's safe, of course. Break the toxic mindset and these negative expectations that everyone has on you. I want to say thank you for watching to this point of the video, and I know it's a change from my usual style, but don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoy this type of content, and let me know what I could improve or what you enjoy most. This has been Ray, signing off.